Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Iran and rival Saudi Arabia are talking. That, since April, is in the open, though it began with back channels, including facilitation by Iraq. On Tuesday, Iran reported good progress in talks with Saudi Arabia, but said some of their disputes were complex and may take time to resolve. Disputes indeed are complex, and not just because of sectarian denominational differences, though both sides have used those differences as markers in the struggle for projecting power in the greater Middle East. Riyadh, more properly the House of Saud, has long claimed to be the leader not just of the Arab world, but the Muslim world. Since the revolution in Iran and Tehran's theocratic realpolitik, denominational differences have increasingly defined the power struggle. Iran's attempt to use Shiite populations to its advantage is a fact noted by all observers of the scene. Ditto for Saudi Arabia, that has used its funds and charities across the Muslim world to peddle Wahhabism. Iran's nuclear and missile programs aroused deep insecurities in the Gulf states. Both sides have been in opposite camps in Iraq and the ongoing conflict in Syria. Reports during the Trump administration even claimed Riyadh was prepared to back any Israeli attempt to take out Iran's nuclear facilities. Regardless of the truth in such reports, they did indicate the nature of relations. The Yemen war added to the problems. With Trump gone and the U.S. indicating a return to the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, it appears that the Gulf states want to engage Tehran and dial down the tensions. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Adnan Tabatabai, author and noted Iran analyst and CEO of Center for Applied Research in partnership with Orient. Mr. Tabatabai has designed and facilitated Track 2 and civil society dialogue formats between Iran and Saudi Arabia since 2015. Dr. Atifeh Touhyani, who teaches at the University of Tehran, and Abdulaziz Al-Ghashian, who analyzes Saudi politics and foreign policy. Thank you to all my panelists. Let me begin with Mr. Al-Ghashian here. Mr. Al-Ghashian, last time we spoke about this, there was indeed some discussion of the complexities involved in resolving issues. So then and now, has anything improved? In other words, is there a clean text on some of the things?
I think there's certainly not any significant developments as of yet. And I think both sides will attest to this. And both sides have actually articulated speculation. This is actually one of the common things that they have, is that they're both not, they have no qualms articulating that they are suspicious of each other. Yet, at the same time, they've also articulated that they are willing to see a resolution, but it's going to take time. So I think to iron out these differences will certainly take a lot more than just complex and vague statements. These differences will be resolved through, I think, very clear actions by both sides. Both sides have to interpret the other's actions as accommodating or at least willing to work side by side or work willingly to reduce tensions and to build on the areas where they do have commonalities and interests. One thing that I just want to take this opportunity to remind the viewers is that, I would like to reject the notion that many people say in the discourse that Saudi Arabia and Iran are just antagonistic in every sense of the word. I think that's very inaccurate and a very superficial reading of these relations and the history of these relations. There have been areas where they've cooperated, where they've agreed, and so that needs to be revived again. But in order for it to be revived, trust has to be instilled back into them and to their perceptions of each other again, and that will take time.
Right. So your answer, frankly, raises more questions than it answers my question. But that's the whole idea behind this discussion. So I'll of course get back to you with some more questions. But let me pull in Dr. Touhyani into this debate before I go to Mr. Tabatabai, because as I said in my opening, he's been arranging track two on both sides. So I want him to listen in and then give me his view of where he thinks things stand. So, Dr. Touhyani, what do you think of why is Iran responding to the reach out? What are the Iranian compulsions? What is the playbook for Iran here like?
Of course, stopping relations with Iran is in relations of Iran and Riyadh is neither in the interest of none of the countries. Both countries desperately need each other to build a stable, secure, and of course prosperous future for two nations. And I hope that these recent tensions are the beginning of the end of all these ups and downs of Iran and Saudi Arabia relations that have continued over the past 3 decades. And this dialogue may lessen the tensions. Of course, the first, of course, would be the 7 years of war in Yemen, and tens of thousands of Yemenis that were died in 6 years of war. There would be this dialogue would be a termination. I hope that it would be a termination for these years of war in Yemen. And of course, Iran is also critical of Persian Gulf states for their continuous alliance with Washington and their support for sanctioning Iranian and the signing of normalization agreement with Israel. And these are the Iranian concerns. And Iran is hopeful that they can reach to a conclusion after all these years of unsuccessful negotiation, of course, secretly or open negotiation with Saudi Arabia, and of course this.
So the Saudi Gulf states reach outs to Israel is one concern. The war in Yemen is another concern. And of course, Saudi Arabia's partnership with the United States is yet another concern, and so on. So let's get to Adnan Tabatabai here. Mr. Tabatabai, since you've been trying to build bridges of sorts through track two, give me your sense of what the concerns on both sides are.
I agree very much with a lot of points that my dear colleague from Riyadh has already said, Dr. Abdulaziz, and also the points that Dr. Atifa made. The point is that really the differences between both sides are much more political, geostrategic, referring to the security of both countries rather than being ideological or being in any shape or form grounded in religious affairs. That's really not the case, and it's very important to stress that over and over again.
But let me come in here, Mr. Tabatabai. This is without prejudice to what you're saying, because as I said in my opening also, this is about reality, this is about power projection, but we have also seen that both sides have, in fact, used the denominational differences as a marker to appeal to their respective camps. So it's not something that one can completely set aside.
By no means, indeed. But I would use the analogy of an engine that drives conflict, and that engine is geopolitics. And ideology and religious thought and sects can be the fuel that make this engine drive faster or slow down. So you can, in one way or another, try to slow down the engine of conflict by being more accommodating, as Dr. Abdulaziz said, and try to, in one way or another, alleviate the concerns of the other side. So I think what we have witnessed in the meantime, 6 years of work that we in CARPO and our partners in other organizations, mainly the East-West Institute and the Stimson Center, have done is to really see that there is a clear interest in terms of economy, in terms of environmental issues, in terms of security-related affairs such as counterterrorism, in terms of the new geopolitics of energy in the region. And it's important for us to keep in mind that in OPEC, for example, it's not as if Iran and Saudi Arabia are on opposite ends when it comes to the discussion of how to handle the market price. So we have seen these different fields in which Iranians and Saudis would probably like to work with each other much more if only the geopolitical context allowed it. And let me close by saying that obviously, we now have an administration, a government in Washington, which is less keen on seeing these two countries being basically at each other's throats. There is more incentive for both sides to accommodate each other in one way or another. And I am extremely delighted, in fact, to see that those who are currently holding the talks in Baghdad are security officials of both sides, because these actors are the ones that need to, in fact, start the talks before they then translate into the actual diplomatic and political realm.
Right. Now, this point that with the change of the administration in the United States, obviously the environment has certainly improved to the extent that the United States does not want, as opposed to how the Trump administration was working towards this, to basically, enable the fact that these two rivals can come together. Nonetheless, and on this note, let me go back to Abdulaziz Al-Ghashian. My concern is that, frankly, we need to go for hard-nosed analysis. I mean, hope, as we say in strategy, is a four-letter word. It's all very well to hope for things to improve, but there are structural reasons for why relations are where they are. Of course, as a student and teacher of political science, you're well aware there's those structural reasons, those binds, those constraints are very important. Iran definitely has a desire to project power in the greater Middle East. And not just a desire, but we've seen empirical evidence of that. Saudi Arabia, as I said, has traditionally looked at itself as the leader of not just the Arab world, but the Muslim world. So these are two countries that are contesting for the same space. And that contest over the last 30 years has drawn a lot of blood and left lots of very bad feelings. So I want you to tell me, for instance, let's get into specifics. How can these two countries reconcile their positions, let's say, on Syria, on Hezbollah and Lebanon?
Well, I tell you what, I have to agree a lot with what my colleague said, and my colleague in Germany, Adnan, said, because what you've just said or mentioned in the question was really about identities. It was that projection of identities. But I tell you what is not the structural issue. Okay. Let me begin by that. That is the notion, the sectarian notion, that these sectarian differences are the crux of the matter of why they are disagreeing. So it's important to try to eliminate that while understanding that it plays a role in the geopolitical struggle. So now, departing from that, there's something endemic in the perceptions of the Middle East, which is zero-sum perceptions that all states seem to be suffering from. The fact that one gain cannot leads to my loss, and that there cannot be a win-win situation. And so it is with great regret that I say many of the states in the Middle East and the perceptions of each other is viewed and functioned in a zero-sum fashion. So once that is dealt with, then you could start to see spaces of opportunity where they can cooperate in different spheres, where they can actually compete in and understand, and not only just compete, but compete and understand that there can be objectives gained on both sides. That one does not have to eliminate the other's chances, and vice versa. So this is we're dealing with something far more deeper than just geopolitics. We're dealing with perceptions of survival, of existential perceptions that, listen, if this country gains something, then it might lead to something else. And this is just not constrained to Saudi-Iranian relations. This is constrained between Arab relations too, and beyond. So that's one area where that needs to be challenged. And now, where can we address this? Who can address this? It is us, the academics, us, the analysts, us, the reporters, us, the journalists, who help curate or help establish or contribute to perceptions in the Middle East, or at least identities in the Middle East, that are not completely antagonistic, that we can look at, we can have a bottom-up approach to this. Now, rather than get sucked into the dogmatic perceptions of, of viewing the Middle East. Because I tell you what, demonizing Iran within Saudi Arabia and other Arab states is not only something that a country does for its geopolitical gains, but it does to adhere to domestic audiences. Iranian demonization of Saudi Arabia and claiming that it's colonized and it's part of the United States and et cetera, adheres to domestic audiences, some domestic audiences. So if there is so in other words, these domestic perceptions give political oxygen to the zero-sum fashion. Now, forgive me for speaking all, about perception and philosophical and et cetera, but this is what my answer is. I hope you could accept that. But that's what I mean, is that it's a deeper situation rather than just geopolitics. It's really about perceptions and how people perceive the other side. And therefore, because what that does is that it helps countries behave differently towards the others.
Right. What is difficult to figure out is the direction of causality, whether it's the perceptions that are leading to what's happening geopolitically, whether it's geopolitics that then requires the creation of perceptions in the way that you just mentioned, the perception of Iran and Saudi Arabia, the perception of Saudi Arabia and Iran, et cetera, et cetera. But I still, frankly, want some specific responses. So let me try Dr. Touhyani here. So, Dr. Touhyani, let's assume the security people are in Baghdad. They're talking about, obviously, lots of these issues. Assuming they're also talking about Yemen. You mentioned Yemen in your first, statement, and you talked about what's happening in Yemen. Now, here's the thing. Let me put on the Saudi cap, and let me say that this is essentially my South, Saudi Arabia's South. And therefore, my near abroad, not in the sense particularly of Saudi influence in Yemen, but at least Saudi security. And so Saudi Arabia doesn't want any elements in Yemen that can threaten it in whatever manner. And there is a clear concern of the Houthis being supported by Iran. Now, is this something that Iran and Saudi Arabia can work out?
Before just answering your question, I want to mention the thing that my colleague talked about, a zero-sum game. And I want to say that it was very interesting point to raise. Of course, both groups are made mistakes in the relationship, and the first step for any further negotiation would be acceptance of all those mistakes. And of course, for the issue of Yemen, it is the same. Of course, for the intervention of Saudi-led military coalition and Iran-aligned Houthi groups that came into this crisis, they have to just came into conclusion that those sides made mistakes, and of course they have to stop this zero-sum game, and of course,
Dr. Touhyani, let me intervene here. I'm sorry to interject here. I accept the fact that, you know, what you're saying, or what Abdulaziz Al-Ghashian is saying, or what Adnan Tabatabai is saying, expressing good sentiments is perfectly fine. But, you know, there are actually multiple elephants in the room. And so therefore, I think at the end of the day, we have to get out of the poetry of good wishes to the very hard-nosed prose of what is there on the ground at what needs to be tackled head-on. And so my concern really, my question is whether the two sides have reached that point where they can tackle those issues head-on.
I think, yes, they can be successful in some issues, that Yemen would be one of them. But I think that the regional talks and talking all about old issues in one table would not be possible. As you know, that the regional talks have been going on since 1919s, and so far they have not been successful because the fact that Middle East is a fragile and dependent regional system with foreign intervention very decisive, and negotiation are not possible without their permission. And this negotiation happened because United States just allowed the side to sit in the table. So it is because of the weakness of the efficient regional system in the Middle East compared to Europe and Latin America and the African Union that are very successful. I think that they can handle the issues, some of the issues, but of course the whole problem of the region would stay, and it would not be solved whole together, because two sides are in fact search of leadership of Middle East, and they are having rivalries against each other. And it seems that the influence in the region is also another issue that they are searching for. So I think that, yes, they can get to some conclusion, but not a long-lasting conclusion that would stand for a couple of years, maybe. In some parts, Saudi Arabia is undecided in some parts and amazed in its partnership. It sometimes approaches some countries like Israel, and whenever the situation requires, they approach Iran. And it seems that they are not very, in fact, they then made up their minds to do this partnership and conclusion.
Okay. As far as the Israel issue is concerned, I think Abdulaziz Al-Ghashian has also done research work on that. But Adnan Tabatabai, let me try and assail this issue from a different angle. So when you were doing these track twos, clearly you must have had, listened to the Saudi concerns, the Iranian concerns, and then areas both of convergence and divergence. If you could quickly list those concerns and what possibly can be the low-hanging fruit, that'll be great for us.
Look, let us, for the sake of being in the current news cycle, think about the talks that are currently going on in Baghdad. The big issues between these countries are obviously security related, and those security related issues are driven and designed by the respective security apparatuses, which is, again, important for us to really keep in mind that currently it's the security officials talking to each other, and they have to speak about all the difficult themes that you have raised as a host that we haven't been really able to dive into, be it Yemen, be it Syria, be it Iraq, be it other contexts. And this is what the so-called big guys really have to sort out, the guys in the dark security corners that we have no access to. When we do any sort of track 2 meetings, in fact, researchers and scholars who are not necessarily decision makers themselves, but do have certain access to decision makers, are then invited to think a bit outside the box, to think in more creative ways than politicians can possibly do, because they are not within those chains of political interest, but they can think of the unthinkable, so to speak. And then they, in our meetings, outline themes that are very specific, as I said, environmental issues, economy-related issues, things about migration, about counterterrorism, these very, very focused themes, so that you do not at all times have to discuss history, have to discuss who came first, did which thing first, and then the whole blame game story unfolds. So these are really different tracks. And when it comes to the current ongoing talks in Baghdad, it's obviously going to be very transactional at the beginning. These two sides will not design a big plan for peaceful coexistence with each other. These two countries desperately need a positive precedent of agreeing to alleviate each other's concern. And this can be the Saudi side demanding the Iranians to speak to the Houthis in Yemen to reduce their attacks on Saudi territory, while Iran encourages the Saudis to be a bit more forthcoming towards the Houthis. In exchange, Saudi Arabia, which we may have actually heard about, is interested in somehow returning Syria back into the League of Arab Nations, into the Arab League, so to speak, something that for Iran is obviously of interest if their ally Bashar al-Assad is in one way or another rehabilitated, so to speak. And this is very transactional. It had to be very specific at the beginning, and potentially in the next 1, 2, 3 years, this can then develop into some sort of a grander scheme for peaceful coexistence. And for that to happen, and this is my final point, we need to have very specific lists of where these two countries can work together, so that on day X, when political leaders are willing to join forces, we as scholars and observers and experts can present them a whole list of different areas where cooperation can take place.
Thank you. Now, those were some specific points. I was really looking for some of those specific points, so thank you so much, Adnan Tabatabai, for those. Before I wrap up this segment, Abdulaziz Al-Ghashian, give me a sense of why Saudi Arabia, clearly under the helmsmanship of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, wants this reach out and wants some kind of clearly dialing down of tensions, some kind of modus vivendi where the two sides can work. What are the Saudi compulsions here?
It's very, it's very interesting, and I think at times it's very clear, because I think what the Saudi ruling elite have deduced and have concluded is that a turbulent region is not good for Saudi Arabia. A turbulent region is not good for anybody. And I think where they want to go, and the trajectory of the country being a very economic-driven country, has to be in a region where there is relative stability. So this notion, it's also detaching itself from the American dependency, and it's trying to become the new hub now, economic hub, an epicenter of the economic world.
So you basically, sorry, I'm just fast pacing it because I have to wrap up also. You're basically saying that this is part of the broader sort of agenda that the Crown Prince has with reference to economic reforms and also sort of, putting Saudi Arabia into a different, more modern direction.
He's always said that he is striving for a thriving region. He never said excluding Iran. Okay. So this is something that, I think is one of the characteristics of, or one of the motives why this will be perpetuated in Saudi Arabia.
Okay. So very quickly, Dr. Touhyani, a couple of minutes left. You heard what Abdulaziz Al-Ghashian is saying. You also heard Adnan Tabatabai, actually talk about certain specifics of how some of these breakthroughs can happen. So Saudi Arabia seems to not want a zero-sum game. Is Iran ready for that? Is Iran going to reciprocate?
Of course, I think that Iran was ready for many years for this conclusion. I believe that there's some mistakes that made in their relation, as I mentioned, but I think Iran is hardly in favor of a negotiation because of its own domestic situation, and of course because of other tensions, and because of the situation in Yemen and the situation that it is experiencing in international sphere because of the sanctions, and also while we see that there is a JCPOA coming out, but there are other issues that it's abandoning the final results of JCPOA. So Iran needs this negotiation with Saudi Arabia to calm the Middle East. And of course, as my colleague said, both countries and of course all the countries in the Middle East needs this negotiation, and this would be a turning point if this negotiation gets into a conclusion, turning point into the Iran's international relations.
Thank you. It would actually be fantastic news for the region and also for contiguous states. Thank you so much to Atif Touhyani, Abdulaziz Al-Ghashian, and Adnan Tabatabai for their insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the failure of the new Israeli government to extend a controversial citizenship law. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Israel's new government suffered its first big defeat in parliament, failing to renew a controversial law. The law prevents Palestinians living in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip who marry Palestinian citizens of Israel from gaining citizenship and residency rights themselves. It was the first major political test for Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who for nearly a month now has been heading a narrow and diverse coalition that includes left-wing, centrist and Palestinian parties, along with his own ultra-nationalist party. Let's get right into our discussion of what this law is and what does this defeat mean for the Bennett-Lapid coalition government. I'm joined by Dr. Hassan Jabrin, a Palestinian human rights lawyer and the founder of Adala, a law firm practicing human rights law in Israel, and Professor Neve Gordon, an Israeli professor and academic. Professor Gordon teaches international law and human rights at Queen Mary University of London and has written several acclaimed books. Thank you to both my panelists. Let me begin with Dr. Jabrin here. Dr. Jabrin, firstly, for our part of the world, frankly, you'll have to walk us through what this law is, and then we can take it further with reference to the political defeat of Prime Minister Bennett.
In 2003, the Israeli parliament passed a law that prohibit any Palestinian from West Bank, Gaza, to enter Israel. The goal for that was to prohibit family unification when one of the spouses is Israeli Palestinian citizen and the other spouse is Palestinian living in West Bank and Gaza. And after this passing, the Israeli Supreme Court passed the law by 6 judges against 5. And in fact, this is the first time that we have a huge split in Israeli Supreme Court in very, very constitutional high debate. This law, in fact, say that Palestinian or citizen of Israel cannot marry a woman, and if we speak about married woman, from West Bank or Gaza, and to live together inside the Green Line. And after the passing this law, and after that the Israeli Supreme Court gave its legitimacy, the law itself was amended and added to the list also citizens who are considered that belong to enemy state. citizens of Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. So this law, in fact, prohibits family unification inside Israel, Palestinian and Arab family unification inside the Green Line. We don't know about any law such this example. And before Israeli Supreme Court, we argued that if we want to rely on the comparative law, we cannot find a state that prohibit family unification from its citizens based on their national ethnicity. Of course, the goal of the law was to ensure Israel as a Jewish state and not to allow Palestinians to live in Israel, meaning to keep a Jewish demographical majority group. And we argue that this is the main reason behind this enactment, but the state responds that the reason behind the enactment is security. This is why the law is temporary meaning for 1 year. But since then, the Knesset, Israeli parliament, renew every year the enactment of this law. The validity of this law, because it was enacted as a temporary. But in fact, we are after 20 years and the law is still temporary. So lately, because the composition of this new government, and it includes also left and one Palestinian political party, they didn't succeed to renew the validity of this law. And from here, came the crisis of this government, because the opposition led by Netanyahu didn't vote to validate this law, not because they are against it, just in order to embarrass the new government and to show that this new government cannot pass national important, significant law for the Jewish state.
Right.
So this is where
Right. Very, very interesting. Thank you for this overview and also the reason for the defeat. So let me get to Dr. Gordon here. So Dr. Gordon, this is interesting. Dr. Jabareen has already given us the overview. But let's talk about the politics of this. Now, we have in Israel a prime minister who used to be Netanyahu's protege, was Netanyahu's chief of staff also. Then they fell out. He's got his own ultra-nationalist party. As a matter of fact, it's probably, a couple of millimeters more to the right than even Netanyahu. And Netanyahu now decides not to vote for this law, and in order for the government to be defeated. And as Dr. Jabareen said, not because he didn't want this law to stay. So give us a sense of what exactly is happening politically in Israel, in the Knesset, and how long can this, as I said, narrow and diverse coalition actually last?
So thank you for having me. And I do want to begin, though, with one piece of background, and then I'll answer your question. And the piece of background is that this is an apartheid law, in that it says that one group of citizens in the country can have family reunification and another group of citizens cannot. And you have to understand citizens in the Israeli context, because it is very different from citizenship in Pakistan. In Pakistan, the minute you're Pakistani, you're a citizen. In Israel, citizen doesn't work according to nationality of Israeli being a citizen, but 20% of the population, which are Palestinians, are never Israeli. They are Arab citizens, while me, as an Israeli Jew, I'm a Jewish citizen. So there's a distinction between citizenship in Israel. And both Bennett and Netanyahu support this distinction and support apartheid law. So you're asking me, why did Netanyahu vote against the law that he supports? That his government, he was 12 years in government, and his own government renewed it for 12 years. And he did it for one simple reason. He wanted to shame Bennett, to show the country, here, I managed for 12 years to reinstate an apartheid law, and now you have Bennett, who's also right-wing, but he cannot support this this apartheid law, but I actually do not think that it will weaken the government. I think that first of all, this law really does not matter, because in effect, the interior minister, who is a party member with Bennett, Ayelet Shaked, will not approve any of the requests for family reunifications and find ways of stalling it for years on end. So on the ground, the Palestinians who are from the West Bank and are married to citizens inside Israel will not be allowed to return. And in addition, I think that ultimately the security reasons, which once they needed in order to convince the Supreme Court to allow these laws, are no longer necessary, because in 2018, Israel legislated the nation-state law, and in that law it says very clearly that Israel is a Jewish state for the Jewish citizens, and on that basis it will not allow these family reunifications. So the government is not really threatened by the passing or not passing of this law, and it seems to me that actually this government might have a chance to continue working for a few years, precisely because it is an extremely right-wing government.
Right, that's an exposition. So Netanyahu's only reason was to embarrass Bennett. But Dr. Gordon, quickly, does it also have to do with, we know that Netanyahu is also fighting a legal battle. He's been indicted and the rest of it, and that's something. And he wanted to hang on to his office because that gave him immunity. So give us a sense of where things stand with reference to that trial.
So Netanyahu, I think, is playing a two-pronged strategy. On the one hand, he's trying to postpone the legal proceedings against him, every time bringing new issues to the court and asking for more time, and he's being very successful. And I think that only in the fall will the actual discussions in his cases continue with earnest. At the same time, he wants to get back into power before he is incriminated, before the ruling in the court cases, in order to kind of try to change things from a position of power. So he's playing, on the one hand, a stalling strategy, and on the other hand, he's looking for cracks within the existing government, and every single crack he finds, he's trying to fit himself in order to get. He only needs 2 or 3 people in the government to change sides for him to topple the government. So he needs 1 or 2 people, and these are the cracks he's looking for. This time he looked for a crack in the citizenship law. I don't think he managed to do it, but I think there might be cracks in the future that he will succeed in kind of changing the equilibrium in this government.
Well, he's a hard-knuckle politician, that's for sure. Is not prepared to throw in the towel, not yet. But before I wrap up, let me go to Dr. Jabareen. Dr. Jabareen, Dr. Gordon has explained in detail all the nuances behind how this entire thing worked. So on the ground, nothing is going to change. So is there some space for the human rights groups or for the lawyers, now that the law has been defeated? Is there any space for them to actually agitate this point and try to change the situation on the ground?
Yeah. One of the things that lately this law came to the public again after 20 years and reached the international media, of course, only because the debate between Netanyahu group and Bennett group. But this debate came exactly on time, that the discourse about Israel, not as a democracy, not as a state that manage discrimination, not as a state that has a defect democracy, but the discourse now internationally for the first time getting and gaining to be strong is Israel is apartheid state. We know that the leading international human rights organization, the World Human Rights Watch, issued a report that portray Israel as managing apartheid regime inside the Green Line and on the Palestinian occupied territories from 1967. And beside that, before that was also a report of Israeli human rights organization, one of the leading Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem, that also portray Israel regime as apartheid. Beside all of those, there is a decision of the International Criminal Court that they are willing to investigate war crime that Israel made in Gaza and West Bank. All of this development with this law, the banning of family unification law, which as Professor Gordon said that it's apartheid law, come together in the new arena about Israel as apartheid state. Now, apartheid based on international law is crimes against humanity, and it's included in the Rome Statute that it's the base of the work of the ICC. So I think this thing open for us, all of us, human rights organization, a new windows, a new debate, a new discourse that we can use and rely on those racist law in order to strengthen before international arena and mainly international tribunal that Israel is committing crimes against humanity.
That's an interesting thought. Sorry, I'm interjecting, just fast-pacing this because I've almost run out of time. But very quickly, Dr. Gordon, in a minute or so, would you agree with Dr. Jabarin's relative optimism with respect to the space opening up for agitating this point?
In one sense, yes, in the sense that I think in the international arena, we're in a conjunctural moment whereby governments in the West are still supporting the Israeli government and its apartheid regime. But on the other hand, we see civil society across Europe, across the UK, across the United States, that's saying enough. And we saw this in the last Gaza war, where 150,000 people in London alone went out to the street and said, we've had it with this violence, and we're demanding from our governments to say no to the Israeli violence and to the Israeli apartheid regime. So I do think there is a change on the ground among many civil society actors in the West.
Okay. Thank you. Fascinating stuff. Thank you to Dr. Neef Gordon. Thank you to Dr. Hassan Jabarin for their insights. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.